Well, a couple of weeks ago, we began a series in honor of harvest season called Sowing and Harvesting. I thought this was a good time to take a look at some of Jesus' teachings that draw on agricultural imagery. And as I shared last Sunday, my original plan was to conclude this series today by taking a look at the parable of the workers in the vineyard. You'd find that parable in Matthew chapter 16, but I didn't really feel right about using that parable. It didn't seem like that was the passage God was drawing me to for the conclusion of this series. Superficially, it didn't really fit. I mean, workers in a vineyard, it's still technically agriculture, but not the kind of image that we're used to, farmers working the field. But more importantly than that, I felt last weekend that God was drawing me towards a different passage to conclude this series. You see, last Saturday, I attended an all-day conference in Fishers, Indiana. And there, along with a number of other United Methodist pastors in Indiana, I heard from a couple of speakers who are involved in something called the Fresh Expressions movement. Now, I'll tell you more about what I learned at that conference shortly. But I'd like to start by sharing with you the teaching of Jesus that opened their presentation. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." Now, it's interesting that while we are in a series called Sowing and Harvesting, that I would attend a conference where this was the key passage. You see God working in unexpected places all the time. But as we look at this passage, I want you to think about what Jesus was thinking when he saw these crowds that were following him, what he was seeing when he looked at them. He saw people who were harassed and helpless. He saw people who were wandering aimlessly through life like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus' response to those lost people was compassion. When he looked at them, he saw a harvest. He saw a field full of wheat ready to be harvested, and hardly anyone available to do the harvesting. And so he invites his disciples to pray, to ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into the harvest field. Now, it's telling that if you read the passage immediately after this one, that's where you read about Jesus calling the 12 disciples. Jesus calls together a core group of 12 people, and he commissions them to extend his ministry. He calls together a group of 12 workers to gather this plentiful harvest. After Jesus rose from the dead and the church was founded, this mission became the responsibility of everyone who calls themselves followers of Jesus. And that mission was handed down from generation to generation, all the way down to us. We are the harvest workers of today. And let me tell you something, the harvest is as plentiful as ever. Now, to demonstrate, I would like to invite 5 volunteers, but specifically, I'd like 5 volunteers between the ages of 18 and 38. So if you are between the ages 18 and 38, raise your hand. Oh, Tim, I knew that was going to happen. So let's see, Daniel, Katie, let's see, Grant and Caleb. Come on down. How many is that? I need one more. One more between 18 and 38. Somebody. Come on down. Somebody. Come on. Truaxes are too shy, I guess. Do you have a kiddo back there, Stephanie? Come on down. Alrighty. Now, given the age group represented here, I'm going to be very surprised if the answer is no. Does one of you have your cell phone on you? At least one of you. All right, okay. All right, so I want you guys to make a circle. You know what? I don't know why I didn't invite my wife. She's in that age group. How did you get out of this? Okay, so Daniel, put your phone on the stool, and everybody make a circle around the stool. All right. I have half of mine to bring Heather up here. All right, so try to space yourself fairly evenly around the stool. Now, here's what I want you to do. Go ahead and reach out and touch the phone. Where you're standing, reach out and touch the phone. Now, stay there. Keep touching the phone. All right, now, we are living in a time in history called post-Christendom. All right, so the time after Christendom. During the Christendom era, the church was the cultural center of the community. Okay, so that's what you've got pictured here. It was easy for everybody to become connected to the church because the church was the center of the community. Now, everybody stay where you are, but Daniel, go ahead and hold your phone and hold it kind of close to you. Okay, now everybody try to touch the phone. All right. So you'll notice that it's easy for Caleb to touch the phone. It's a little bit harder for Katie, but it's much harder for Stephanie and Grant to touch the phone because they're farther away. You see, what happened in the you guys can stop reaching if you want. What happened is, in the post-Christendom era, the church isn't the center of the community anymore. This change developed in Europe first, then it moved to the coast, and now it's reaching the Midwest. And so now the church isn't the natural part of people's lives that it once was. Now, for some, it still is. For some people, like Daniel and Caleb, it's much easier. So for some people, it's much easier to think of church as an integral part of your life, but most of the people in the world are like Stephanie and Grant over here. It's much more of a stretch for them to connect with a church. That is the era we're living in right now. Okay, let me get my thoughts straight for the next demonstration. Now, these days, there are a lot of people, you can take your phone back. There are a lot of people who fall into one of two categories, the nuns and the duns. Now, the duns are the people who were once part of a church, but they've left and never come back, and they have no intention of coming back. The nuns are people who claim no religious belief at all. When they're asked for their religious preference, their answer is none. Now, my volunteers are going to help me visualize some statistics for you. So, Stephanie, you can stand over there for a minute. And the four of you make a line right here in the front, right in front of the stage. Make a line. Okay, so look at these four. Now, here we go. Now, the nuns, the people who have no religious affiliation whatsoever, make up 1/4 of the U.S. population. So 1 out of every 4 people in the United States is a nun, someone who claims no religious affiliation at all. Now, Katie, you can step over there with Stephanie for a moment, and we'll just have these three. Now, the reason I asked for people between the ages of 18 and 38 is because that is the age group that we call millennials. Millennials are generally people who were born in the 80s and the 90s. Those are millennials. And by the way, your pastor is a millennial, just so you know. But among millennials, 1/3 of millennials are nuns. So 1 out of every 3 millennials claims no religious affiliation whatsoever. Okay? Now, you ladies come back up here. So make a row of 5. Now, here's an interesting statistic for you. In the U.S., 1 out of every 5 people attends church. 1 out of every 5 people says they attend church, but they really don't. They'll say, when you ask them, they'll say, oh yeah, I go to church. And then you ask them, when was the last time you went? And they'll say, well, I haven't been in a while. That's 1 out of every 5. 1 out of every 5 would go to church if they were invited by a friend, and 2 out of 5 would never go to church under any circumstance. Yeah. So according to these statistics, 60% of people in the United States have no connection to church at all. Does that not sound like a plentiful harvest field to you? All right, thank you guys so much. I can take those back. Go ahead and have a seat. Does that not sound like a plentiful harvest? What do we do about this, by the way? Is there anything we can do about it? Well, I believe there is. And it might require us to rethink what constitutes church. It might mean we have to think about what church looks like a little bit differently. One of the speakers at this conference I went to shared an interesting story. He talked about taking his 2 sons out on a lake that his grandparents took him to when he was little. And he noticed something interesting as he was looking at the docks along the edge of the lake. He noticed that many of those docks ended a lot really back from the water level. You could walk out to the end of the dock and still have a lot of dry ground in front of you before you got to the water. Now, the owners of the docks had some options for how they could respond to this situation. They could gripe and complain about the problem, or they could do something about it. Now, one option would be to have a floating dock, one that adjusts to the water level. But the problem with a floating dock is that it's a bit unstable. It floats all over the place. It might tip. You might fall off. But what if you tethered it to an existing dock? You'd have the stability of an established dock and the flexibility of a floating dock. Friends, the cultural water levels have changed. We can gripe about it or we can adjust to it. But here's the thing that might surprise you. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to do away with church as we've already established. I mean, church, as we've already established, serves 20 to 40% of the population. That's not the majority, but that's still a good chunk of the U.S. population still being served by the established church. Not to mention the fact that established churches have the resources and stability that comes with having been around for a long time. But what we in the established churches need to do is change our approach for reaching out to the nones and the dones. We need to adapt our approach for reaching out to those people who want nothing to do with established church. That 40% over here. Now, the 20% in the middle, the 1/5 that would be would come if invited by a friend, they may still enjoy the established church. But if we're going to reach that 40%, the nones and the dones, we need to get creative. Now, when most of you were growing up, the church used what's called the attractional model. We built a church, we get good music, we get a good preacher, we advertise, and then we wait for people to come to us. That's the attractional model. But here's the thing, it doesn't work. At least it doesn't work anymore. It did at one time. In recent years, when we began realizing the attractional model wasn't working anymore, we tried something else, the engaged model. We went out into the world and we tried to invite people back to church with us. Now that might work for that 20% who would come in if invited, but we still have 40% who wouldn't even come if they were invited. To them, an invitation to church is a real stretch. Imagine that you had a Buddhist neighbor who invited you to temple. To that 40%, an invitation to church is no less strange. But there's another model that we should consider. The engaged model might work for the 20% who would come if invited, but for the nones and the dones, that 40% who wouldn't come to church, even if they were invited, there's something called the incarnational model. The incarnation, by the way, is a Christian teaching about Jesus that we're all fairly familiar with. It's the Christian teaching about Jesus, about how God became a human being in the person of Jesus to enter our world and connect with us. So that's where this model gets its name. Basically, in the incarnational model, instead of trying to attract people or go out to them and bring them back to church, we bring the church to them. We send out people from the established church to lead other worshiping communities, partnered worshiping communities, where the people are. Now, in this model, the established church multiplies its ministry through these extension ministries, through these other worship gatherings. The other presenter at this conference was a United Methodist pastor from Florida. His church was much like ours. Traditional worship style, historical, established, but he developed a ministry called Burritos and Bibles. It was a worshiping community that met at Moe's. How many of you like Moe's? I like Moe's. A few hands. It's a Mexican restaurant, people. You guys need to get out more. No, I'm just kidding. This ministry became so popular that the pastor had to establish another Burritos and Bibles group at another Mexican restaurant. That's how much ground it gained. People were involved in this ministry who would have nothing to do with the established church. But it was an extension of that pastor's church's ministry. And by the way, they counted that as worship attendance. In their weekly statistics, they would add the traditional worship service attendance in with the attendance of Burritos and Bibles, and they would consider that a ministry of their church. Now, there are all sorts of incarnational ministries like that popping up all over the place. There's a ministry like this that's held at a tattoo parlor. In fact, an interesting story came out of that one. The group that met at the tattoo parlor shared in communion, and one of the tattoo artists who was just there, he wasn't part of the worshiping community at that time, he asked what communion was all about, and there was a picture they showed us of that tattoo artist receiving communion for the very first time. That's the kind of impact that these sorts of ministries can make. There's a ministry like this that integrates worship with yoga. There's one that meets in a park for people who like to walk to get exercise. And as I thought more about it, I realized that my own wife, Heather, had been in the early stages of establishing a worship community like this at our last church. She met weekly in the local library's community room with other moms of small children. Toward the end, she had started developing a Bible study component. There was at least one of these ladies who had not been to church in years, not since she was a child. But she had gotten plugged into this group that Heather started and had started participating in a Bible study. And that's how these groups form. It begins by connecting with people over something you have in common. You form a community naturally. You form a group of friends naturally. You develop these relationships. Now, you don't want to do it with an agenda. You want to have the kind of relationship that you would continue being friends even if this never turned into a ministry. But once you get to that point and you've really connected as a small community around this commonality, around this common interest, then you consider introducing a spiritual component. And then you see where it goes from there. You see how it grows from there. Now, be aware that these groups don't always succeed. They're experiments. Even if they don't always succeed, the point is to try. Try and try until something sticks. Now, typically, when groups like this have failed, it's because they've either moved too fast, they haven't let relationships grow naturally, or they've moved too slowly, never moving past just a community of friends. But when we look at the harvest before us, we have to recognize that trying something like this and failing is worse than not trying at all. And by the way, most of these groups were led by lay people. The ordained clergy were in the established church encouraging and resourcing and helping lay people go out and start these ministries. Most of them have been lay-led. And this appears to be the direction that Christianity in America is going. In the United Kingdom and on the coast, churches have already been experiencing for quite some time, maybe 10 or 20 years, what we're just now beginning to see in the Midwest. And this new way of expanding the kingdom has proven to be a very fruitful way to respond to the changing culture. It's been fruitful in the United Kingdom, it's been fruitful on the coasts, and it can be fruitful here. But it's going to require us to reconsider what constitutes church. We're going to have to think outside of the proverbial box. Now, I'm sure when you think of Methodism, the last thing you think of is innovation and out-of-the-box thinking. But I want to talk to you about our founder, John Wesley. There's a picture of him. It's kind of dim, but you can see him. He's the founder of the Methodist movement. Wesley was an Anglican priest, a priest in the Church of England, and he remained a faithful Anglican until the day he died. He had a friend named George Whitefield who would go out to where the people were, field preaching. He would go out to the quarries and the marketplaces, and he would preach there where the people were. Now, this practice was appalling to the established churches. It was offensive. It was seen as inappropriate. Even Wesley wrote, "I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been in a church." But on April 2nd, 1739, Wesley, in his own words, submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in the ground adjoining to the city to about 3,000 people. Wesley, the founder of the Methodist tradition, left the comfort of the cathedral to preach from a little hill outside the city of Bristol. He went to where the people were, and he launched a movement and a spiritual awakening that changed the face of Christianity in England and gave birth to the Methodist Church in America. May we follow his example. May we too submit to be more vile. May we answer the call of the Lord of the harvest. Because, friends, just as it was in the time of Jesus, maybe even more so, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. May we find new ways to be the workers of the harvest, new and creative ways to bring in the nuns and the duns, because they need Jesus as much or more than we do. But it's going to take creativity, it's going to take courage to reach out to them. So may God inspire us and empower us to carry out that mission.